This title doesn't agree with the program, but it is hot off the press. Some may remember that in March 2020, I was to speak on monetary history. With all the uncertainty, of course, that never happened. In the meantime, I took on a narrower target, no less dear to my heart, which is the Indo-Sasanian coinage. But today I'm coming to you with a hybrid of a narrow and a wider topic, both regarding attribution. So the first part of my talk will focus on the reattribution of a particular type of Indo-Sasanian coin called Shri V. But the second part will focus on our collective obsession with attribution of coins and whether this is always a good thing. What exactly do we mean by attribution? And is it either feasible or even desirable to attempt precise attributions in every numismatic circumstance? As their name implies, Indo-Sasanian coins were an Indian coinage evolved from Sasanian prototypes. I think most of our members will be well aware of the broad, thin silver coins of the Sasanian Empire up to the 7th century. These became known in India directly due to sea trade between the Persian Gulf and coastal Gujarat, and by land contacts through Seistan and Sindh and the Gujarat interior, as shown by these red arrows. But huge numbers of Sasanian coins passed into the contemporary Hephthalite realm of Bactria, eventually finding their way directly or through Alkan and Hunnic imitations into eastern Rajasthan, as shown by this pink arrow. These two separate migrations gave rise to two separate but related coinage series, whose distinctive distribution is shown here by green and yellow shading. Premlata Pulkarna dubbed these the Aravali West and Aravali East series, based on her observation that in Rajasthan at least, they tended to occur on either side of the northeast-southwest line of the Aravali Hills, which I've indicated here by red shading. To the west and south, the prototype drachma of Sasanian Emperor Feroz gave rise to a distinctive series characterized by being anepigraphic, which is bearing no legends, and therefore anonymous. The series remained in production some 8 centuries, slowly evolving from thin and broad, which you see in the top left, to thicker and narrower, which you see on the right-hand side, ending up small and dumpy and almost featureless, which you see on the bottom right. Collectors nowadays call them Gadya, although contemporaries called them Bilamala dramas, after their birthplace. Along the way, there were a few local issues in which a ruler was cited, and at the end, a secondary series was issued in Malwa that bore some legends and a few letters. But these were the exceptions that proved the rule. By and large, these coins were without legend. Initially being associated with the city of Bilamala or Binmal on the Gujarat-Rajasthan borderlands, they traveled south into the Konkan and southeast into Maharashtra and Telangana, probably carried by the diaspora of Binmal merchants. As a young numismatist, I rashly tried to attribute these to individual Gujarati kings. However, I think we can recognize now that such attribution is sometimes neither possible nor necessary, and more on this later. The second Indo-Sasanian series was based on Sasanian prototypes that were altered by passing through Hephthalite or Alkan Hun's intermediaries. And these arose along the eastern flank of the Aravalis in Marwara, according to Maheshwari. They bore some lettering, although seldom full words, and do not comprise a long, slow evolution like the Bilamala coins, but rather appear as a series of distinctive types, which you see here, each one bearing some elements of earlier prototypes, but also new elements unique to each type. They give the impression of being not the coinage of a single community, but rather the coins of successive polities. Contemporaries called those in the first line Vigrahapala dramas. Those in the second line they called Adivaraha dramas. One common element throughout was a single honorific word or letter shown here. The prototype featured the Brahmi letter Sa atop the crown. Slide. The next, called Shri Ha, featured the word Shri atop the crown. Slide. The next, called Shri Ja, a phrase that's been read as Pri, but which may be a truncated Shri. The next, called Shri Ma, featured Shri on the crown. And finally, the last, called Shri Vi, the word Shri slipped off the crown to sit to the right of the king's face. The series terminated with the legend-bearing issues of the Pratihara Empire in the 10th century, shown on the bottom line, that is 300 years earlier than the first Bilamala series ended. So the direction of influence and evolution of this second series was northeast, eventually becoming the dominant money form of the Ganga Valley under the Pratihara Empire. These two series have been well studied for some 2 centuries, and the broad picture of their evolution and distribution is well established. In our time, it's worth highlighting the profusely illustrated catalog by Dr. Michael Michener in 1979. In the following decades, Professor Pratibha Bhatia published her analysis of a number of hordes in several articles, such as in this 1991 one. In 2006, Premlada Pukharna published a well-illustrated review of the series. However, the first comprehensive treatment was the massive 2010 study by Dr. Kamal Maheshwari, which drew on typology, metallurgy, metrology, horde distribution to accurately classify and delineate the many strands of Indo-Sasanian coinages. So it was with some surprise then that we were recently presented a major reattribution of the Vigraha Paladramas by our esteemed senior Professor Pratibha Bhatia. This was tucked into her presidential address on other matters, given at the Numismatic Society of India in 2017. After a discussion of museums, she raised the subject of Indo-Sasanian coins. The remainder of her presentation involved the reclassification of a well-known Indo-Sasanian type, Shri V, as the issue of an early 8th century Emperor Yashovarman, as you see here in her presentation, thereby reattributing material she had presented in previous decades. Her argument was long and well annotated, but can be summarized as follows. 1. There are Indo-Sasanian coins found together in the Ganga Basin with legends Shri V and Shri Vigra. 2. Although previously I viewed them as related, both dating to the 8th century, I now believe they are not. 3. I continue to read Shri Vigra, but now date its paleography to the 10th or 11th century. 4. I now read the other as Shri Ya and continue to date its paleography to the 8th century. 5. There was a ruler of Kanauj in the early 8th century named Yashovarman, to whom no coins have been attributed. 6. So I attribute the Shri Ya coins, hitherto Shri V, to Yashovarman. To see the implications of her reattribution, note the relative position of Yashovarman, early 8th century, vis-a-vis the well-attributed 9th and 10th century coins of the great Pratiharas, Bhoja and Vinayaka. She would now place the Shri V coins about a century earlier than the Adivaraha coins of Mihira Bhoja. Much of her argument rested on paleography, that is, what can be inferred from the style of writing. In this case, Professor Bhatia traced a single akshara, Shri, in contemporary epigraphs. But perhaps more germane would be comparing letters on contemporary coins. And surely the letter to focus on would be Va or Ya, the key to her new identification. Here we see the Shri Vigra and Shri V coins side by side, left and right. And it is noticeable that the form of the letter Va or V differs on the two. The right-hand Shri V could certainly be read as bearing the letter Ya, but it clearly bears an imatra, shown here on 3 specimens from Michael Michener's catalog. It would thus be read as Shri Yi. But the letter Ya in Sanskrit is an antasht or semi-vowel, and there is no word in either Sanskrit or Hindi that begins with a Yi, i.e. Ya modified by a short or a long E vowel. So the akshara can never be read as Yi. It must be read as V. Hence, it absolutely cannot be the initial of Yashovarman. This ambiguous rendering of the two letters is not a surprise. Note the style of lettering on this contemporary coin, the post-Kidarite issue in the name of Vinayaditya, dated by the Raja Tarangadi to the later 8th century. Here it can be seen that within the king's name, both Vi and Ya are rendered by the engraver as virtually identical. Yet the reading is unequivocal, as is our observation that in this period, engravers sometimes represented the letters Va and Ya in identical fashion. Only the context can distinguish them. But to properly assess Professor Bhattacharya's reattribution, we must consider as well the comparative fabric within the coin series. Professor Bhattacharya herself had previously asserted, and I illustrate here, the close relationship of Shri Vi and Adivaraha coins. This slide shows the reverse of both above, Shri Vi on the left, Adivaraha on the right. Note the similar design element of a rectangle bracketed by tumbrils or vases, rendered similarly on both the Shri Vi and Adivaraha, but on no other coins of the series. Note as well the attendants left and right, and the oval shape at the bottom, which are similar in the two issues. This similarity is so marked that Kamal Maheshwari published specimens of each side by side. On the left is Shri Vi, on the right, Adivaraha. Note the reverses are virtually identical in execution, size, and orientation. Clearly, these two coin types were minted in close proximity of time and place, and perhaps even rendered by the same engraver. So they cannot be separated by a century, as Professor Bhattacharya now asserts. In addition to paleography and comparative fabric, we may also cite the hoard evidence, much of it published previously by Professor Bhattacharya herself. This table summarizes 13 hoards found in Uttar Pradesh and Rajasthan. The first thing to note is the close association of Shri Vigra and Shri V coins, which are almost never found alone. Both types are usually present together. But Professor Bhattacharya now believes that the Shri V coins, which he calls Shri Ya, are early 8th century, while the Shri Vigra coins are later 10th or early 11th century. Their close association in hoards would argue forcefully against the 2-century gap. As well, we can see from the column of Vinayaka coins that these early 10th century coins are seldom found with Shri Vigra coins. So the hoard evidence supports the idea that Shri Vigra coins are earlier than Vinayaka, i.e. no later than the 9th century. Also noticeable is the fact that in no hoard were there Adivaraha coins without Shri V coins also being present, which reinforces dramatically the observations about the close proximity of the two types on the basis of fabric. So to summarize, with the evidence of paleography, fabric, and hoard association, we cannot support Professor Bhattacharya's contention that the Shri V coinage can be attributed to Yashovarman. Rather, it's likely the Shri V and Shri Vigra coins circulated together sometime during the period of the Pratyahara rulers Vatsaraja and Nagbhatta, although we cannot determine if those persons were associated with their issue. We can reaffirm the attributions of Adivaraha and Vinayaka dramas to those two Pratyahara rulers, although with the proviso they may have been issued and circulated for long periods posthumously. This whole exercise got me thinking about attribution more generally. My professor, A.K. Narayan, taught that numismatics is the science of classification. We consider a coin classified when it's been described through images or legends, metal, shape, size, weight, edge, die orientation, die identity, etc. But we consider it attributed when its circumstances of issue have been determined, possibly its denomination, its date and place of minting, the issuing authority, etc. Clearly, some of these criteria are objective, that is, scientifically verifiable and replicable. That would be metrology, metallurgy, die orientation, die identity, easily verifiable. Others of my criteria are subjective, that is, a matter of opinion. And here we would say style of image or lettering, meaning of legends, quality of engraving. Now, attribution draws on both types of classification. It also requires context, that is, a knowledge of geography, history, and chronology. Newer and older coins alike can all be studied with the same objective rigor. They are things. Things can be tested, studied, poked, and prodded. However, the older the coins, the more uncertainty around subjective and contextual criteria. Where context is weak or non-existent, which is true in some periods of ancient and early medieval India, coin attribution can be very problematic. In these cases, we may have to be content with the description of coin characteristics and distribution patterns and accept that attribution to issuing authorities, i.e. historical figures, may never be attainable. Despite this, based on common criteria, we may group unattributed coins into types that allow them to be arranged chronologically or geographically. This in turn assists the study of coin finds, hoards, and excavations, helping to determine the distribution pattern of coins in circulation. This de-emphasis of hard attribution is an issue that Shailen has discussed in his study of so-called kacha paisas, where he has urged us to look beyond classification and attribution to consider the broader landscape when dealing with anonymous coins. In other words, to suppress the numismatic urge to always attribute to an historical individual, and rather to emphasize the coin type and geographic distribution patterns. This was certainly the case with the Bilamala dramas, lacking specific legends, as we showed earlier. It was also the case with the majority of Gangetic Vala Indo-Sasanian coin types that bear only truncated letters, as we showed earlier. As shown so well by Kamo Maheshwari, a thorough articulation of the known characteristics, evolution, and distribution patterns of specific unattributed coin types will still yield valuable and reliable information of considerable utility in historical and economic studies. For these types of coins, the question is not who done it, as Shailen says, but rather what happened. So our foray into Indo-Sasanian coins reminds us of a larger truth. Unattributed coins can still yield valuable insights. Thank you.
Thank you, John.